voices that you hear in this tape belong to dozens of asylum seekers having lunch in the canteen of a temporary reception center named Borici. We are in a small town called Bihac in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a few kilometers from the border with Croatia. It's lunchtime and the room is quickly filling up with people. There are long lines of tables and benches and children running around them. Dozens of people queuing for food. On the walls of the canteen, one can spot drawings of flags belonging to many countries: Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Syria, Morocco, Algeria, even Cuba. These are the countries where many of these asylum seekers come from. From these countries, they embark on dangerous and long journeys with the hope of seeking asylum in the European Union. Bosnia, where the center is located, is not a member state of the European Union. Because of its violent history, precarious economics, and delicate political system, the country hasn't met the requirements to join. But from Bihac, the EU is so close. You just need to cross the mountain that divides the little town from Croatia, a European Union member state, since 2013. Most stories about migration are about those who leave, but not this one. This one is about those who stay and those who get stuck, and how these lives overlap in a place that everyone else has left. The story I'm going to tell you is about this mountain and the asylum seeker that attempt to cross it. It is also about the system of deportation and torture that prevents them from crossing the mountain, and of the reason why, of all places, they are stuck here, in this particular town.
Wow. If the government touch me, I have two time. I will not one.
The story I'm going to tell you is also about the people inhabiting this town, once a glorious industrial center of former Yugoslavia, ravaged by a ferocious and bloody war, and now abandoned by almost everyone. This episode is about all of these histories. And yet, to tell them, we won't need to look further than the walls of this building whose inhabitant we are listening to. Their stories hide within layers of plaster and paint that cover the walls of this canteen, and which have never been unraveled before, until now. My name is Benedetta Zocchi, and you're listening to Material Crimes. Let's take a step back, shall we? First of all, where are we? Bihac is a small town located a few kilometers from the Croatian border, which today separates the Western Balkans from the European Union. The Borici Temporary Reception Center is located on the southwest side of the town, a few kilometers from the mountain that separates it from the border. Since 2018, this has become one of the bottlenecks of the so-called Western Balkan route.
To Bosnia now, where the small Balkan country is struggling to contain an escalating migrant crisis. Over 23,000 migrants from various regions like the Middle East and South Asia are stranded in the country.
Some are trying to cross into Croatia, a European Union nation, but since neighboring countries like Hungary and Serbia have closed their borders to migrants, most end up trapped in Bosnia.
News about asylum seekers walking across the Balkans is always delivered this way. Much of the focus is on where asylum seekers come from, the Middle East, Southern Asia, and where they're going, Croatia, the European Union. This gives the misperception that asylum seekers are always on the move, which could not be further from reality. That's probably the reason why I decided to study this particular border, to go beyond the very meaning of sentences like most end up trapped in Bosnia. What does it mean that they are trapped? Why in Bosnia? Is it even legal to trap someone in a country? How does this work? Well, 4 years and a PhD later, I still have no answer to these questions, but I've developed many other insights from this journey. So let's see what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Croatian police have often been accused of targeting and beating migrants. Amnesty International has accused European Union governments of turning a blind eye.
They take everything, shoes, jacket, money, mobile phone, everything they take it. You see this beating very badly. What is this? We are human, not animal.
From Bihac, the small town where our story began, asylum seekers try to cross the border on the Plitsevica mountain that separates the country from Croatia. The Croatian police systematically capture asylum seekers, torture them, detain them, and then deport them back to Bosnia. So it's important to remind ourselves that countries on the western side of Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, and Italy, are members of the European Union and have human rights obligation according to its own convention. In the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 18 and 19 establish the right of asylum and protection in the event of removal, expulsion, and extradition. And Article 32 and Article 33 of the Geneva Convention establish the crimes of torture and protection of civilian persons against collective penalties. The torture and violent removal that are a key part of the pushback practices that migrants experience along the Balkan route are very clearly in breach of these conventions. To address these illegal deportations and human rights violations on its borders, the European Union could have sanctioned the Croatian government. Instead, it has decided to direct funding to the International Organization for Migration to set up so-called temporary reception centers where migrants can find shelters after having been illegally pushed back. Just to make the point crystal clear, the strategy goes like this. Asylum seekers are first prevented from exercising their human right to ask for asylum in the European Union, then tortured, and then forced back to Bosnia. And what happens here is even more interesting. In Bosnia, the European Union takes advantage of the dozens of buildings left abandoned during the 1990s war by turning them into reception facilities. Reception facilities that wouldn't be needed if illegal pushbacks did not take place in the first place. Temporary reception centers are set up everywhere along the EU borders, in Serbia, in Macedonia, in Bosnia. In a way, their presence is material evidence of Europe's compliance with illegal deportations. They exist because asylum seekers are constantly deported and illegally prevented from exercising their rights. But of course, the problem that Europe tries to solve by setting up temporary reception centers is not depicted as a problem of human rights, but as a crisis that Europe cannot solve within its borders. And where better than a post-genocidal, politically and economically unstable country like Bosnia and Herzegovina, which continues to live in the aftermath of the Yugoslav war that broke up Yugoslavia and saw grave war crimes committed on all sides. Seeing asylum seekers temporarily living in the spaces that are the wreckage of former Yugoslavia and the remains of the war, abandoned factories, houses, hospices, student accommodation, is a powerful image, and a violent one. In Bihac, temporary reception centers are set up in the ruins of a war too recent to be forgotten and too painful to be remembered. These infrastructures that have been repurposed as temporary reception centers have haunted the city of Bihac and its inhabitants for decades, way before the arrival of asylum seekers. During the recent Bosnian War, Bihac was held under siege for 3 long years. These wrecked buildings stand immobile, silent, constant and unwavering reminders of the bloodiness of war. Conquered by vegetation and rubbish, these slowly decaying buildings are held in suspended animation, much like the asylum seekers who today are trapped in this purgatory along the borders of the European Union. Which makes me wonder, can we sift through the ruins of these buildings for evidence that will help us unravel the long history of marginalization, resistance, and solidarity that has taken place along this border? The walls of Borici Temporary Reception Center tell stories. Stories of resistance, of violence, and of displacement that bring together different histories of border conflict in the borderland called Bosanska Krajina, which in Bosnian means the Bosnian frontier. The legend of this place goes something like this. When ancient Romans reached the land now known as Bosanska Krajina, they had been through so many wars that they had lost the ability to recognize beauty. This was until they saw the emerald green waters of the river that crossed that land. As if awoken from a spell, at the sight of this enchanting spectacle of nature, one of the soldiers exclaimed, "Una," which in Latin means unique. And that is how the river got its name. Today, the Una flows across Bihac and gives the name to the canton where Bihac is located, the canton of Una Sana. The river's water are still a shimmering emerald green, and in its waters you can find reflections of the red roof of the low houses on the shores. All around, the Plzevica mountain holds Bihac in a green hug. For centuries, after the Romans came, the hilly curves of Plzevica have delineated a border between different sides of Europe. It has been the western edge of the Ottoman Empire and the eastern edge of the Habsburg Empire. It has been occupied by the Croatian fascists and reclaimed by Yugoslav partisans. It experienced the industrial renaissance of the first decades of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the destruction brought with the war that followed Bosnian independence. Throughout history, this piece of land, conquered again and again, but never directly ruled, has remained on the fault line of different kingdoms, empires, and occupations.
First of all, Krajina, it's a place on the border, because in Bosnian language, kraj is the end. So Krajina will be ended lane or a place on the end. Let's say that the Krajina, or place where the Bihac is located, was the border after ancient period, especially in the Middle Age, when it was the border between two kingdoms. Also at the 13th century, when the Bihac's growth, Bihac was mentioned as most eastern city of the West, because it's the eastern side of the Croatian-Hungarian kingdom. And then, after Ottomans came in Bosnia, and after Bihac became a part of the Bosnia Eyalet, or part of Ottoman Empire, Bihac tend to be a most western city of the east.
Asmir Piralic is a history professor who has lived in Bihac all his life. He is also the most passionate historian I've ever met, enthusiastically responding to my constant requests for information and documents.
At the 15th century, this east border of Bosnia is the border. Right there is Pravoslavic Europe. Right here, Catholic Europe. And right here, you are having Pravoslavic, Catholic, and Muslim in Bosnia, So it's because of that mixing everything. And over here is the Bihac, the last city in the border, over here. So every time you have influences from the east, you're having influences from the west, And in the, Ottomanic history, this is that border between east and west. And here is the Bihac, And that mountain over here, Pirševica, you read the Izačić border, right?
Yeah.
Yes. That mountain, Pirševica, is even right now, she's the border between European Union and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And in the history, she was also the border between east and west.
For centuries, the whole territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina has been inhabited by multiple South Slavic populations. 3 of them, the biggest ones, developed into competing national identities that are still strongly divided today: Bosniak Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholic Croats. In Bihac and Krajina, for most of the Ottoman and Habsburg occupations, Muslims, Serbs, and Croats lived peacefully together. People lived and worked across the two sides of the Plitsevica mountain. In both periods, Krajina, which, as Asmir reminds us, means frontier, remained a border region, too distant to be completely assimilated into the ideologies of the many kingdoms and empires that ruled it, but too important to be given up. In the 1940s, Krajina was again occupied, this time by the Nazi-allied independent state of Croatia. At the time, Krajina was almost equally inhabited by Muslims and Orthodox Serbs. The fascists decided to consider the Muslims in Krajina as ethnic Croats and focus their energy on repressing the Serbs. Groups of Serbs dissident emerged against the fascists and began to also target their Muslim neighbors. In 1942, the partisan resistance reached Krajina, which was finally liberated in 1945. Today, there are several memorials celebrating victims of fascism in Krajina. One of them is a partisan cemetery located in the southern part of Bihac, in what is today known as Borici Park, which sits opposite what is currently Borici Temporary Reception Center.
When I was a little boy in the school, the most important thing for the children from the school is to come here and to learn about the enemy of fascism and that never happens again. We was little children, but they still learned us to appreciate this suffering people and these fighting people for our freedom and our Yugoslavia, etc.
I visited the cemetery with Almir Kurtovic. Almir works for the Bihac Tourist Center and is a history enthusiast. He spent his childhood in Bihac in the 1980s and remembered this cemetery as a landmark of pride for the town. He explained to me that this is one of the few landmarks in Bihac where Serbian, Croat, Jewish, and Muslim martyrs are celebrated together as united partisans.
45, Abdullahovic Suleiman. Then, look at this, Obradovic Branko, it's a Serb. So you have here Muslims, Jews, Croats, Serbs.
Is one of the few cemeteries where you can have them all.
Actually the onlyest. It's a communistic. All these people are fighting against the fascism.
The partisan cemetery sits on the lower edge of a hilly road on the side of a long alley in the south of Bihac. The alley constitutes a direct passage to the Plitsevica mountain, where Bosnia and Herzegovina encounters the Croatian border. It is surrounded by green grass and pines, which give this part of town its name, Borici, which literally means pine forest. It is here where the partisan heroes have been buried and celebrated that our journey starts. On the upper edge of the hilly road where the cemetery is located sits a huge building. We have already been introduced to this building as Borici Temporary Reception Center. But this building has been sitting on the hill way before the arrival of asylum seekers.
This place, as Borici, is existing long before. Now when you say Borici, migrants, problems, crisis. But in history, it has a lot of other meanings.
Walking to Borici Park from downtown Bihac is almost surreal. 1 second, you are in a town, and a second later, you are surrounded by nature. Today, the Partisan Cemetery and the Temporary Reception Center sit in this quiet space, almost unnoticed, looking at each other. Here, past and present mingle with one another, and with the border that is only a short distance away. A border which was the site of such intense fighting during the 20th century. On the 4th of November 1942, the partisans liberated the city of Bihac from the fascist occupation and established what became, for a short period, a liberated pocket under partisan control, named Bihac Republic. While Bihac was soon reoccupied by Nazi forces, partisans continued to operate secretly. In that month, though, Bihac hosted the first meeting of the Anti-Fascist Council of the National Liberation of Yugoslavia. A majority of Bišćani will tell you that Yugoslavia was first imagined in Bihac.
The first meeting and the first laying keystone for the future of social Yugoslavia.
The Yugoslav period is remembered as a particularly peaceful and prosperous moment by Bihac inhabitants, who often look back at this time with nostalgia.
Everyone had a job, everyone had a vision of the country, everyone had an idea of the country, and everyone feels safe because Yugoslavia had army, Yugoslavia was a big country, you know. After that, we are so small right now.
At the time, Krajina was an important industrial and manufacturing center in the Federation. New factories opened in Bihac and across the whole region, giving new manufacturing jobs to thousands of people. After a decade of tension and violence, people could go back to live normal lives in unity. One of the biggest issues during this period were the hundreds of children that had been orphaned during the war.
So, and now you can imagine how important it was for the government to build the camp for the orphans still in the near of this cemetery and of this park. That the children, they are living here, they have it present all day, how important it is to be honest, to be to continue this fight against fascism and nationalism.
In 1954, the building, which would later become the Borici Temporary Reception Center, was built as a home for 200 orphans from Krajina. It was dedicated to the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, which took place in Bihac in November 1942, and given the name Dom Avnoj. But by the end of the 1960s, all the orphans who had lived in Dom Avnoj had grown up and left the building.
After this, they get to school, after then gym, faculty, and they get their jobs and their families, and this is a very amazing story. How this poor state get this problem to integrate. I had teachers in my school here. They was orphans.
From Borici?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I know some people without mother and father, they get the school and the job, married and own children, and this is from Borici.
After the relocation of the orphans, the building remained closed for some time, until the end of the 1980s, where it was repurposed as a student house. Almir narrates this story with great enthusiasm, as a mission that evolved, from mending the past and its broken children to building a better future for the next generations. This was, in his mind, what Dom Avnoj was created for, and what Yugoslavia dreamed of being. But this dream had a very short life, as Yugoslavia itself was about to collapse, leading to one of Europe's most atrocious conflicts.
The Bosnian War in the former Yugoslavia was the worst conflict in Europe since World War II, claiming 100,000 lives and displacing over 2 million people.
On February 29, 1992, following the example of Slovenia and Croatia, the Bosnian government held a referendum for independence, with 64% in favor. Voting results immediately caused dissent across Serbian separatists. In the following 3 years, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina evolved into a chaotic and contradictory sequence of civil massacres, sieges, mass imprisonments, deportations, rapes, and reshuffling of alliances in what is often remembered as a conflict with no winners. The war looked different in Banja Luka, in Pale, and in Mostar. In some places, it was Serbs against Muslims. In others, it was Muslims against Croats, and others still, Croats against Serbs. In Bihac, the war arrived in summer. At the time, Asmir was 11.
I was a child. I was 11, and I remember that in that time we were at the school, but we knew that something is going on because our friends, mostly Serbs, were disappeared. Every day, some of them went. In that time, there is equal, let's say, Muslims and the Serbs in Bihac. Let's say a little less Croatian. But in every class, we had so many Serbs, but we didn't know it. In our period, especially before 1991, it wasn't, at least for me and for my friend, it wasn't important. We were all Yugoslav, but what can we do? And yes, in our class suddenly disappeared some students, suddenly disappeared some teachers.
Many Bišćani I've been talking to remember this detail. Their Serb friends left suddenly, days before the army entered the city.
I remember that I lived in that time in building on the 4th floor, and my parent told to me and my brother, let's go down there, the 1st floor, in one Serb flat. And inside of that, the boy and girl who lived in that flat were there maybe 2 or 3 days ago. I remember Natasha and Milan. And I remember in that flat, in the stove, there was a bread. It means that the parents, they made the bread, but maybe 1 hour, 2 hours before Bihac grenaded, they went from Bihac. I remember it.
The war arrived all of a sudden, and nobody expected it. When the army entered Bihac, everyone celebrated it. They thought it was there to support them against whoever was the enemy. But they were wrong.
I remember that we were outside. In that time, there was a war in Bosanska Krupa, city near Bihac. But we also thought, no, there will be no war, because it is our army. And in that time, at the 5th June, weapon from the big airport zone named Željava military airport, the biggest military airport in Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav army took that weapon outside of that airport zone, and it went across the street in the city of Bihac. And I remember that in our school we had assignment that we need to take some flower from the garden and throw away through that across those street to that weapon, because it's our army, and yes, you are protecting us. And that night, in the morning, maybe 5 or 5:30, we heard first grenades in Bihac. It was horrible, I remember. First of all, we heard big explosion in Željava, because Bosnian Serb or Yugoslav army was detected Željava. And
the Serbian army had reached Zeljava, a secret military base built on the Plečevića mountain, a few kilometers from Donamnoi, where students were living at the time. The army took everything and destroyed the base. For the following 3 years, it held Bihac under siege.
And yes, after that, we were 1,201 day we were at the siege. so many civilian victims we had, so many soldiers died. We were a protected zone, but all the time we had grenades in the city. I was 5th grade, my brother 6th. Yes, my brother wounded in front of our building, 1993. 2 of my friends died after grenade fall there. And my brother right now is having 9 gallers in his body. But he's not invalid because he's okay, he can walk. And unfortunately, so many friends of mine are killed. We didn't have so many to eat, we didn't have something to drink because there is no water in the system also. But yes, there was a playing, we used to have a decent life. Unfortunately, it's humanitarian aid, but it's also small and stuff we eat also or very badly. But what can we do?
After the siege and wider war ended, came post-war reconstruction. As almost all parts of life had been damaged by the war, almost all parts of life also had to be rebuilt.
And in the beginning we were dealing with this reconstruction after the civil war of the 90s that was very, I don't know how to define it, it was huge. You can saw everything destroyed at every corner, every step.
Silvia Maraone is the social coordinator of an Italian organization called IPSIA, which stands for Institute of Peace, Development and Innovation, and works supporting asylum seekers traveling the Balkan route. Silvia has lived between Bosnia and Serbia since the 1990s and witnessed in person the transition that Balkan societies experienced after the end of the Yugoslav war.
And I remember Bihac, it was the first city I visited after the war, and I was a volunteer in Slovenia before, and I was shocked by the devastation. So you had empty houses, skeletons of houses, all the roads with holes. You didn't have traffic lights, you didn't have electricity, there was the curfew, you couldn't walk without documents, you need permission for everything. So it was a very difficult situation.
When the war broke out, our building, Donavnoi, which you might remember was now being used as a student housing, was evacuated almost immediately because it was extremely close to the Serbian front line. During the siege, this area was often targeted by snipers, and it was extremely dangerous for people to live there. When the war finished in 1995, Bihac was liberated, but both its infrastructure and social fabric were severely damaged. Like many other buildings in town, the ruined Donavnoi building, riddled with the scars of war, remained in disuse, left to rot, silently waiting to be used again.
Especially, for example, here in Bihac, but also in other big cities of the country, there were a lot of industries giving work to thousands of people. And with the beginning of the war, we can say that from a population of 4 million of inhabitants in Bosnia at the moment of the conflict in 92, half of them left the country. And means more or less 2 million of people had to leave, decide to leave. And not all of them came back after the war, because the war lasted 3 years mostly, and the people that was out of the country started a new life in another country of the world. So we have this first, process of leaving the country that is related to the war of the 92-95. After that, people came back or stayed with the hope and the aim to rebuild the country after this civil war that was terrible, as I said, and they trusted in the possibility that this country could have a new start, a fresh start. But because of the political system and because of the fact that the old industries were all of statal property, and so it was not clear who was the owner, who had to rebuild, and there was no private investment. There were a lack of job, so a lot of people didn't have where to go to work. because just small enterprises or shops are functioning now. And for this reason, the people after 10 years, so from 2005, I could say, more or less from my point of view, started to leave the country. And a lot of them started to go first in Croatia or Slovenia, and then Austria, Germany, Sweden.
The industrialization, mass migration, and depopulation, and the highest rate of unemployment in the whole country all tell of Bihac's deep and unresolved trauma accumulated over multiple consecutive wars. But this trauma also remains embedded in Bihac infrastructure. From the hills surrounding Bihac, which has still not been completely cleared of landmines, to the monuments dedicated to war martyrs, to the war cemeteries displayed across the village and towns in the Unasana canton. Many buildings are still empty and pockmarked with bullet holes. Donavnoi was among these buildings. From the 1990s to 2018, it sat, abandoned, on Borici's hill, covered in the scars of war and shrouded in silence.
So it was, in my memory at least, and then how it became, it was this huge building in this area of the city that take the name from the pine, because Bor, it's pine in Bosnian, so Borici is pine wood, let's say. It was a huge devastated building, unfinished after the war. It was, I remember, holes on the walls, on the floors, so it was completely not in use, and with vegetation and garbage, a lot of garbage.
It was completely covered in the bushes, high grass, and the trees that were, exiting out of the windows and out of the doors. It was full of trash.
That second voice you heard was Adem's. Adem is a 23-year-old student from Bihac and a good friend of mine. He is also part of the generation born and raised by those who lived under the siege.
And you could see that it was the place of where people would come hide from the town to, I don't know, drink, smoke, in the end do drugs, because it was that dark place where nobody would come. And at that moment, to me, that was a bit disgusting and a bit scary as well, because you would never know, who would you run into. It was pure concrete, mold, water dripping from the ceilings, like all those scary things that you see in horror movies.
While Adem was a kid, he and his friends used to explore the abandoned structure of Donavnoi, a haunted place on the hill, with the mix of excitement and fear that make kids' adrenaline spike. Growing up, though, it became more and more familiar to him.
But then, as the time was passing and I was growing up, I was interested also in the street art, into graffiti. So that was one of the places, abandoned places, where the law enforcement wouldn't be every day, let's say. So you could go as a kid as well to practice your graffiti skills, and where you would go to practice your art skills, because wherever you else go in the town, everybody can see you and everybody would call you vandal. And at that moment, it was full of graffiti, it was full of also regular vandalism, not the street art. But I would say that Borici and one another building in Bihac was the only place where actually street art and graffiti artists could express themselves without being judged in the town as vandals.
Silently waiting on the hill, the abandoned and wrecked edifice of Donavnoi now had yet another function. It gave Bihac youth a place for self-expression.
And you're coming from the home, from the house probably, where both of your parents were in the war. You go to the school. Most of the professors that are older passed the war. So that trauma is something that you cannot run out of. The fact that you have not been explained why all of the people around you are so agitated and are so on the edge and are easy burning, I think that's a big, huge problem. And another big problem is that national identity is still the thing that is pushed and that you cannot run away from, no matter how old are you. So I think while I was going to the high school, the path in which you are looking to, trying to find yourself and trying to find and establish your identity and represent yourself in the society as something or somehow, most of the people who are lost, who have some big trauma, they're going forward and they're catching on nationalism.
Adem's words show the inevitable contrast between the generation that lived the war and the one that succeeded it. For a short time, in its rotting and abandoned state, Don Amnoi provided an outlet for the post-war generation's need to escape the heaviness of reality and express themselves through art. As if staying true to its original purpose, the ruined orphanage continued to offer shelter for Bihac youth. But in 2018, the building entered a new chapter.
So it used to be that migrants who were trying to enter Europe via the so-called Balkan route would go first to Serbia and then across into Hungary or into Croatia from there. In 2015-2016, the Hungarians and the Croatians essentially sealed their borders with Serbia, which has diverted that flow of refugees into Bosnia. So they go into Bosnia now and they're trying to cross into Croatia from there. Of course, Croatia is part of the EU. Neither Bosnia nor Serbia are parts of the EU. Bear in mind also for Bosnia, I mean, this is one of the poorest countries in Europe. We talk a lot about how dealing with refugee flows is a challenge even for wealthy countries, even for politically stable countries. Bosnia is one of the poorest countries in Europe. There's aid from the EU and from Turkey coming to help out with this situation of these thousands of refugees stranded there, but the UN is warning that as winter approaches, without more help, this could turn into a humanitarian crisis.
Since 2015, which many remember as the year of the so-called migration crisis, several routes have opened across the Balkans, which asylum seekers travel as they try to reach the western side of the European Union. But only in 2018 did Bosnia and Bihac become part of these transit routes.
Finally, at the end of a long day and night, the breakthrough they'd hoped for. The European Union has reached an agreement with Turkey that they believe marks the beginning of the end of Europe's refugee crisis.
This is a real game changer.
The days of irregular migration to Europe are over.
Our objective is to discourage illegal migration, to prevent human smugglers, to help people who want to come to Europe through encouraging legal migration.
On the 18th of March 2016, the European Council signed a joint action plan with the Turkish government, which aimed to, and I quote, substantially curb the number of arrivals in Greece and prevent their onward movement. The European Union deployed 6 billion euros for Turkey to invest in migration management, and both parties agreed on a sorting strategy to deal with refugee resettlement. The EU-Turkey deal followed the closure of both the Serbian and Croatian border and officially signaled the closure of the route. But in practice, this closure didn't really happen. Here's Silvia Maraone again.
Well, I think that it's very important for anyone listening to understand that it's not that the migrant see a map and decide where to go, just pointing on the map and building some route by himself. All the routes are changing. The most difficult become to cross one part and then the traffickers open a new route and then again and again. So it's a continual game of changing routes, paths, finding new ways, but of course it doesn't stop. Migration cannot be stopped.
In the last 5 years, Silvia's work and that of IPSIA, the organization she works with, have changed completely. After a decade of focusing on the rehabilitation of the local population, she had to completely divert her work to support asylum seekers traveling on the route.
At the time, I was already living in Serbia working with the migrants on the Balkan route. The people started to come from Serbia, not only going to Croatia, but also coming to Bosnia and Herzegovina, crossing the whole country in horizontal. And from the eastern side of Bosnia, they were coming to Bihac. And we had to deal with this situation because every day more and more people in the spring of 2018 started to live in some abandoned building, some traces of the war that I was describing before, and squatting these old buildings. And we started to cooperate with the Red Cross city of Bihac and dealing with the humanitarian aid in the beginning.
But why did people decide to come to Bihac? I asked Silvia to help me retrace the patterns that lead migrants to this border.
What happened after 2016 when the Balkan route was officially closed by European Union and Turkey deal, so-called, the people got stuck in Greece, but then started to move from Greece to Macedonia and from Macedonia to Serbia, and then trying to go straight or to Hungary or to Croatia on the left side of Serbia means. Destination, somehow, willing destination for the majority of the people on the route was Germany first. What happened in 2018? It happened that after 1 or 2 years after the closure of the route with Turkey, the Croatian government and the Croatian police started to control more and more their border and to use violence much more than before, and using to do the so-called pushback, irregular pushback of the people from one border to the other. So basically the traffickers decided to try new routes because it was difficult to cross from Croatia, and so they opened the Bosnian route. And from Tuzla, that is on the eastern side of the country, the people in the beginning went to Sarajevo, and then from Sarajevo they went to Bihac or Velika Kladuša, so basically on the northwest side of the country. From here, we are distant 340 kilometers from Trieste in Italy. That is the end, let's say, of the Balkan route.
Today, Bihac is once again, as Asmir will define it, an eastern city in the west, as it is the eastern border of the European Union, and a western city in the east, as it is the western border of the so-called Western Balkan states, the group of post-Yugoslavian countries that are in process of EU integration. And now, the building we have been following throughout this episode, sitting just a few kilometers from the EU border, sprawling, ruined, found a new purpose. When the very first small groups of asylum seekers began to arrive in Bihac, Donavnoi was one of the buildings they used for shelter. Adem was there, working as a Red Cross volunteer.
The funny fact is that first meal that Red Cross actually gave, and me and my friends were in that first group of volunteers, we didn't imagine that those migrants would be like, it was the numbers of 50, 60, 70 people. Those were the first group that was given food. And the food that was given was actually given in alley, not in Borici, in the facility Borici, but in the alley, in the actual alley, in the passage, in the walk path. And we put their tables and we were giving their food.
And then the people started to use it as a shelter. The Red Cross of Bihac started to bring food and then benches, and then we started with the project of the collective kitchen. That is one of the projects that we are still doing in Lipa. So we distribute food, and I remember we were buying wood and pots to let the people cook somehow in safety. I remember that we had the volunteers going there every day, and then the Borici was closed during the end of autumn 2018, and was somehow there was the first renovation, so by European Union, and then IOM opened it in January 2019 as a temporary reception center.
In 2019, the International Organization for Migration intervened in Bihac. Supported by EU funding, they opened several temporary reception centers across the Unasana canton. Remember when I told you about the European Union's backing of these shelters and what they do? Well, the case of Borici was slightly different. The building was not chosen by authorities, but by the asylum seekers themselves.
Borici was meant and still is a center for families, unaccompanied minors and vulnerable categories. So it's a place that can host, I think, more or less 600 people. The best would be when it hosts 300 people because it's a strange building, it's a strange architecture, if I can say. Mm-hmm. So inside is a small labyrinth. I always get lost inside Borici. There are rooms, there is just one big hall that is used as a canteen to have breakfast, lunch, dinner. And then there are organizations working inside Borici, but not inside the camp because there is no place, but outside in the yard there are containers for the organization.
People who stay in Borici can remain there for unpredictable amount of time. The border, in fact, has been extremely difficult to cross, and the situation still hasn't changed.
There are repeated stories of desperate journeys getting even harder. Danish aid workers have collected nearly 150 interviews from migrants and refugees who say Croatian police beat them. This migrant from Bangladesh shows his scars.
When they caught us, they started beating us with sticks and kicking us as if we were animals. Then they searched us and took away our belongings, our mobile phones and money, before taking us back to the Bosnian border.
We came to Bosnia. It took like 14 hours of walk. Just me, my mom and my dad. And we were 2 months in Bihac. We tried like near 10 or 12 times to cross the border, but every time we failed. Yeah, and once we were walking for 7 days. And we were 4 kilometers away from Slovenia, but the police caught us.
Elena is a young Iranian woman I met in Borici Temporary Reception Center in 2019. Like many before her, and like many after her, she traveled with her family for months, only to get to Bosnia. They arrived in Bihac after repeatedly and illegally being captured by the Croatian police, beaten up, deprived of their phones and belongings, and brought back to Bosnia.
It was awful. The treatment of the police, it was awful. They hit the man, and even me and my mom, not like the man, but they did. Then they were like awful.
This is not an isolated story. Organizations such as the Border Violence Monitoring Network have collected hundreds of testimonies from asylum seekers abused and tortured by Croatian police, and no efficient measures have been taken by the European Union to officially stop them. For the past 5 years, this border has been turned once again into a spectacle of violence.
And the funny part was that we walked for 7 days and the police just brought us back in 1 hour and 25 minutes. And that was like, I'm not going to do that anymore. And I was so tired.
The European Union has contributed substantial funds to Croatian border management without securing meaningful guarantees that Croatia's border policing adheres to international human rights norms and complies with EU law. On one hand, the building, which now hosts the Borici Temporary Reception Center, is continuing to fulfill its original function of providing shelter for people, offering temporary accommodation to young migrants in need. But looked at differently, its function has been entirely co-opted, transformed from a place of shelter into a place of containment. And while, at first glance, these temporary reception centers look like the European Union is fulfilling its humanitarian responsibilities, in fact, temporary reception centers like Borici only exist because of the EU hostile immigration regime, and their desperation to avoid violence along the border itself.
It's not fair.
Yeah.
I mean, you say that every human, they are all the same, but this is not fair and this is not the human rights.
Today, violent pushbacks of migrants on this border remain a daily practice. Between January 2020 and December 2022, the Danish Refugee Council recorded nearly 30,000 pushbacks. Approximately 30% of pushbacks recorded in 2022 were of children, alone or with families. In April 2023, Human Rights Watch interviewed more than 100 people, including more than 20 unaccompanied children and 24 parents traveling with young children. Some people said Croatian police had pushed them back dozens of times, routinely ignoring their asylum requests. Borici is the last temporary reception center in Bihac. While police brutality against migrants crossing the Bosnian-Croatian border, just a stone throw away, remains a visible reminder of the violence hardwired into the European Union. 70 years ago, on the southern hill that leads from Bihac to the Croatian border, next to the graves of hundreds of partisan martyrs, a structure was built to give shelter to some of World War II's orphans. 2.5 decades later, the structure was converted into a student accommodation. Evacuated during the Yugoslav War, which saw the breakup of former Yugoslavia, the building stayed empty for more than 20 years, attracting young local people who turned the wrecked walls of the buildings into canvases for their street art. Today, it hosts young asylum seekers produced by different conflicts across the world. The building, like the town, is a fault line where multiple generations, identities, and histories encounter one another. It exists because of the border, but its history has also been one of resisting border violence. Thinking about all these makes me wonder about how buildings shape our world. All buildings are a bit like courthouses, spaces of contestation where different versions of past and present wrestle with one another. They are also like forensic evidence, containing the traces of crimes, like World War II, out of which this building, Donavnoi, now Borici Temporary Reception Center, was born. And they are silent witnesses to suffering and to trauma, like that felt in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars, but also to the resilience of the people who live with its material scars. And maybe, just maybe, in their quiet testimony and material resilience, buildings are also an appeal to the future, offering the building blocks needed for resistance, trust, and reconciliation. I wonder if, in the creative collaborations that have happened between migrants and Bihac's youth, within Borici's walls, we might be seeing just that.
If I can say something more, maybe one interesting thing we are trying to do is working on the social cohesion between migrant population and local population. So creating occasion to put together the people in this place that they have to, share, because migrant population is somehow sharing this territory with the local people. So it's necessary to offer them the possibility to know each other. That doesn't mean that the migrant will stay here, but also Bosnian people is living from here, but knowing each other, it's a way to, to help in construction of different kind of society.
The problem is that during Yugoslavia, the border was not here. Border was just imagined, it was just in the mind. While today you have it physical. Even though some people from here don't see it like that, and a lot of people, they even have citizenships of Croatia from here. like, even though they are Bosniaks and they're like, I would say Muslims, but I wouldn't put in category Bosniaks and Muslims together in the sake of speaking about same groups. But I think that border, it's a big problem for everybody. And for us here in Bosnia was actually, like the people from Bihac, was actually just another obstacle for the world outside. It's so close, but it's so far, you know. Like you're living so close to the border, and I know people from my high school, my primary school, that never passed the border, that never went to Zagreb, that never went to the sea, you know.
When Adem entered Borici, this time as a Red Cross volunteer and not as a graffiti artist, he consciously saw that as a moment of passage.
When I started volunteering on the start of the migrant crisis, on the start, like in 2018, 19, I would say Borici started to be reconstructed, and we started to, you know, clean it around, start to make that place, because it was the first place that's supposed to be, you know, holding the migrants, people on the move, call them however. At that moment, like, we were fucking getting inside, and we got the information that it's gonna be reconstructed, and I was in a situation in which I was painting over my own graffitis. In the end, I ended up painting that same thing. I was thinking about, okay, I'm one of the persons in the town that is actually volunteering, and there were not so many people of my generation. And the second thing, I'm also one of the person that actually did street art and that did graffiti when others didn't do. But then in the end, when you link that I was doing humanitarian work and I was doing something different, I understand that I have wrong, or at least different ways of thinking than the local community or the people my age. So speaking of that, giving food to the migrants in the first years, and then painting the own graffiti that I did, I think are just different stages of life. Mm-hmm. And my mind was open in different ways, and I didn't know what I was doing until actually I faced it again, and until I went to that building, and I was in that building legally, and I was in that building helping people while knowing that building more than most of them, more than my boss and more than some other people. So it was nice in one way, but in another way it was hurting knowing in what conditions was that building and how it was before. I was glad to see, you know, those changes and that it's used for good purposes.
Adem's wise words perfectly capture the strangeness of what is happening on this border, where struggles of different generations meet. These are generations forced to witness wars that they have no control over, have not been part of, and yet shape their everyday lives. Here is Alina.
My best friend, she always tells me that you're so brave. I can't even go to the supermarket alone, but you're doing this now. Yeah, I think this is the last one. Yeah. They're not going to do that anymore. So the EU countries will just stop doing it from one time, sooner or later. Everywhere in every country, the situation for refugees is bad. Because of that, I think that we are the last generation of refugees.
The stories of Adem and Elina cross paths inside the walls of Borici Temporary Reception Center. Here, they blend with the building's past lives as an orphanage, as evacuated student accommodation, as a derelict squat for Bihac's youth. The many lives of this one building tell the histories of struggle, displacement, and resistance that make this border eternally contested and so hard to unpack. Yet, it is precisely because of amazing young people like Elina and Adem that this building also became a space of encounter. As Bihac continues to be the town on the wrong side of the border, one from which everyone, locals and migrants, want to escape, those who stay slowly learn to read their stories in continuity with one another, to learn who is responsible for their different struggles, and to collectively resist them. As Bihac continues to be the town on the wrong side of the border, one from which everyone, locals and migrants, want to escape, those who stay slowly learn to read their stories in continuity with one another, to learn who is responsible for their different struggles, and to collectively resist them. If there's one thing that this story taught me, is that the more I dug at the foundations, the more layered I discovered, and the harder it got to trace a line between good and bad. Borici is both a space of detention, built by Europe to segregate people Europe does not want, and a site of power and resilience that found itself sheltering hundreds of young people across decades. It is a constant contradiction, forever transforming, like Bihac, and like the people who traveled through here. War, injustice, and solidarity dance in an awkward choreography in this building. Built to mend the wound of a broken past, Borici became the wound itself.
Wow, Bene, what an episode. Thank you so much for putting this together.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It has been great working on it.
I learned so much in this episode, but one of the things that I thought was particularly groundbreaking in terms of the kind of material crimes canon that we're creating here is that it was very much focused on a stillness, or what happens when people are not moving or have moved and then become still. I thought that was really powerful because I think these are the stories that don't necessarily get heard. Like, we're often hearing about the movement rather than where people go before the movement takes place. And I just think you've done so great at capturing such... It's very original in terms of what we've done here, but also these are stories which, really need to be heard as well. So thank you so much for that, Bene.
Thank you. And yes, I think that the element of stillness, I think that the most interesting part is that when I came there and I arrived there the first time for doing my dissertation, that was a dissertation about migration. So it was a lot about movement. So I came there, even when recording the episode, having movement in my mind. But at the same time, stillness is what happens to be at the center. But I think that interesting part is that the two are not disconnected from one another. Is looking at that building at Borici Temporary Reception Center, it's hidden in the woods. It's very still. You look at it and you see an abandoned building, but then and that's the stillness. But then the history and what happens within that building, across that building, is what makes the episode an episode about movement as well. But it's like digging into that. So it's the difference between looking at something and having a first impression, and then re-looking at it after having heard the stories that have made that building, that I think makes it interesting.
We've obviously, as you know, Benny, and as the listeners will now know as well, we worked very closely with you on this episode. So we also know that your episode, when you started out, looked really quite different to the episode, that the story that you ended up telling. So I wondered if you could talk us a little bit through how did you end up with the story that you told?
So for me, the most challenging part when you guys asked me to put together such a challenging project was to focus on one building, because one of the elements of this particular area is that the buildings change. For example, in the beginning, I wanted to focus on another temporary reception center that was a factory, but then it closed. Then I wanted to focus on makeshift camps, but they continued to change. And somehow I wanted to capture both the history of the place, so that stillness, and also the history of migrants. So when I arrived there, my idea was to kind of focus more on the migrants, so telling the story of migration, telling the story of how these places become cages, how these places become spaces of imprisonment for those who inhabit them temporarily, because at the same they have no other option But the fact that this structure exists is basically a testimony to the border. They exist because the border is dead. But then when I arrived there, and again, having the opportunity to know people that lived in the town, know people who have experienced that border before the migrant came, who have experienced different sides, different histories, I sensed that there was more than just a space of imprisonment. There was also a space of resistance. There was a space of resilience. And for me, the coexistence between the two became the interesting part. So I would say that I arrived there with the intention of criticizing and denouncing something that was happening on the border. And that element is still very present in the podcast. But at the same time, I also thought that it was super important to give space not just to that element, but also to all the histories of resilience, to all the histories of resistance that overlap on this border. And I think that, and I remember when we were working on this together, the element of layers, it's very important to that. So reasoning with the layers of Borici, of the walls of Borici, like they are constantly repainted according to the different experiences. And the fact that there is bad and good, it's okay. So they are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they coexist. And it is complex. It doesn't have to be simple. I really, really appreciated the possibility to explore this because, you know, sometimes when you do research, you need to kind of like come some sorts of conclusion. You need to kind of like have a coherent picture. Working in this podcast, working with you guys as well, maintaining it conversational, maintaining it open and dialogical, gave me the possibility to explore that complexity instead of simplifying it. So I think that that's what makes this podcast really rich, this episode very rich.
Come back to like how you came to this building and to the idea of the people who are there living generation after generation, and the story of this graffiti artist who then becomes, you know, a helper and a supporter of migrants and kind of part of this place and part of these different generations folded into the story of the building. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you met him, how he comes to be such a central character in your story, and I guess also what's happening with him since the podcast as well.
Absolutely. And Adem is going to love this. So basically, it's a very interesting story. So I met Adem because, so I arrived in Bosnia in 2018, and I arrived as an activist, and I didn't met Adem there, but I met the organization called IPSIA, which is the one that I also include in the podcast, and I interview Silvia, which works for IPSIA in Bihac. The year later, one of my best friends wanted to do a volunteering experience in Bosnia. So I gave her the contact of Silvia, and she went and she worked with IPSIA. There, she met Adem. They fell in love. They're still in love. They're still together. Aww. And they've been together ever since. And I met Adem actually in Rome when he went to visit my friend. And we started talking about Bosnia. And he was one of the first young people that I met from Bihac, that was from Bihac and was somebody passing through Bihac. So his perspective for me was kind of very interesting because I was able to really, really dig into the histories, really, really dig into like his experience as somebody who lived there, who was there from the start. So whenever I came back to Bosnia, Adem was kind of like one of the people I would go to. He would like come with me to places. He would introduce me to people. He would actually walk with me across the city, showing me the buildings. And what I loved about talking to him and our conversation is that we could walk and he could literally like point me to a building that I have never noticed before and tell me this happened here. And if you see this part, if you see like here, like you can see like there are bullet holes because there was an attack in this moment. And can you see this graffiti? This is from this artist that used to work in this area. So through him, I kind of discovered very important and something that I very overlook, which is the urban and kind of like youth history of Bihac. And also, and that's why also I wanted to include that in the podcast, because this generation was very much linked with the generation of the migrants. and the fact that like they kind of like came together in this space, Adem as a graffiti artist and then the migrants later. And I think that like in the last part of the episode when there is Adem and Edina's voices together, it's very important because it's also a generational element.
We have had other episodes that take place in cities that have like an urban genealogy to their story. But I find your episode, again, like to kind of echo Chantal's, like there's something extra here or like something quite just shifting in our feelings and our emotions in this place because of the like material unfolding that you do with architecture, with the like physicality of the city. In terms of like buildings and commemorative spaces, but the forest, even like we start with a river with this like gorgeous story about how someone sees it and it's like, you know, like these beautiful ideas that are so traveling into the physicality of that space. And I just wanted to see what you think about that.
Yeah, I think, that's a very important element. One of the challenge for me was how do I describe this space without showing that, right? How do I describe the space? And that was like a challenge both in writing and in speaking about it. And so I think that like the audio element helped a lot. So the possibility to record the river, the possibility to record me walking in the woods, because I think that there are some passages in which I'm in the city, like I'm in the town, and then I walk through Borici, and in the moment it's silent. You can hear the forest. And again, I think that one of the things that strikes me about Bihac, but I would say that it strikes me about Bosnia in general, is that there is so much beauty, so much natural beauty. And then there is so much, like the buildings, they're not per se beautiful. They're not built to be beautiful. It's a very kind of like Soviet architecture. So they're built to be functional. But at the same time, that functionality is lost because many of them have been bombed, many of them have been abandoned. And then they are rehabited in different ways through graffitis, through people who are squatting them. So I think that like the materiality of that stays, like the interesting part about this materiality is that the nature, the buildings and the people, the story that is created is integrates all the three elements. So you end up, for example, when it comes to Borici, I have not seen Borici in person before it was a temporary reception center. The first time I entered Borici, it was already a temporary reception center. But I saw pictures and I had description. And for me, it was very interesting how people were describing it as a place that was extremely dirty, but explained that was, and I think Adem says that in the episode, conquered by vegetation. It's like this idea of like there is the abandonment given caused by the war, then there is the nature that try to reconquest it, and then there are people who goes there and the nature mixes with the graffiti. So again, I think that complexity again is that element of not looking at one singular element, but trying to explain how all of this coexists together and work together is what I try to do with it.
I think you do that really amazingly. That like there's something about the kind of, number one, you were talking about stories and you said, you know, I didn't know how to kind of describe the place. And I feel like there's something so rich in the episode in terms of all the voices that you bring in and the kind of, you know, all the local historians that you have that have this really kind of deep and fine-grained knowledge of the, you know, the place that they live, and then your voice and the way that you tell the story, and they kind of braid together in this really rich way that feels a bit like the river that you start with. You know, there's something of all these voices coming together to tell these different but kind of combined stories, I guess. And then the other thing that I do think is really amazing about it is something about the way that through the way that you tell these, the kind of changing history of this one building, I feel like we get a sense of the kind of, you know, the way that history haunts infrastructures and the way that it kind of lives in kind of latently in these infrastructures and gets reactivated, you know, like the way the kind of histories of, you know, war and dispossession that, you know, generations like Adem's have they live with the kind of memories of these things. Those things then get reactivated in their activism and the way that they kind of reapproach or sort of adopt these other buildings. And I really just want to echo what both Shari and Chantal said. There's something very kind of special and very different about this episode that I feel like, we haven't really encountered across the series thus far. So I'm so grateful to you for having told this story.
Thank you so much, Maya. This is very kind of you. If I can just add on that, I think that one interesting thing about when I was collecting the data is exactly that when I started asking people about Borici, they were like, what do you want to know about that? It was just like an abandoned building and now it's a refugee center. But then they started remembering. So everybody actually had memories associated to the building. Everybody knew something different about the building. They had been never asked about it. So it's like those things become forgotten because they just stay still. Life makes them invisible, but then the memory stays. And I think that giving them the possibility to revisit that memory, to revisit their relationship with that building was, first of all, a privilege for me because I learned so much. But also, I think that, it was a great opportunity to try to tell a story about a place that, if you go to Bihac, you look at this building and you see one of Bihac's problems, while at the same time, there are so many other layers that take place and that building represent.
Bene, what would you like listeners to take away from this episode in terms of the politics of all of this, in terms of where the hope lies? What do you think are some of your kind of key messages from this episode?
Oh, that's a hard question. For me, one of the things I would like listeners to take out from this episode is exactly the idea that even when we are criticizing something, even when we're trying to speak about a crime, a material crime, and in this case, we're talking about a crime that Europe is committing in so many ways because it's a crime of bordering. Even when we're doing that, there are always different perspectives. There are always different stories, and there is never a right or wrong. So if we arrive there, having in the case of Bihac, having in focus the migrants, and you talk to the people inhabiting Bihac, then may say something that the migration is a problem. We might think that those inhabitants are part of the Europe who want to create border. But then if you unpack where those opinions come from, what did they actually mean? And if you kind of let them tell the story, instead of in contrast with that of migrants, but to build their stories in resilience and relation with that of migrants, you realize that actually there is a solidarity between these two categories. There is a resilience that is constructed on this border that is just less visible than the border itself. So for me, what I would really want people to take out is that there are so many layers between right and wrong, between good and evil, and that there is never one singular story. So it's okay to make mistake. It's okay to go try to find out something and finding out something else, and having that humbleness to always being informed by listening and by letting people tell their stories, no matter what their story is, but letting them speak about their stories and having the humbleness of being there listening and say, okay, maybe I judged too early, and also having the freedom and the humbleness to change your mind and to welcome the stories in your story. So accept complexity as well.
Beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you, Bene. That was awesome.
Bene, thank you so much. And listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.